It's not fair. Ever come across that in your house? Often accompanied by a slammed foot, or as they get older, thumping stairs, feet going up the stairs, and a slammed door. It's not fair. But actually, it's not just children, is it? We all feel that sometimes. It's just not fair. We are made to long for justice. It's something that we recognise and we feel the need for, particularly when it's absent. Think about this week and the exam results just gone past. That's been one of the big cries, isn't it? It's not fair. It's just not right. It's what's fueled the protests in Beirut, as the Lebanese government have failed to deal correctly with this ship that then has led to this massive explosion. It's not fair. Why are we suffering for your incompetence? Think about the Black Lives Matter protests we saw a few months ago. Whatever you think about that, what is fueling it is a sense that it is not fair that you are more likely to die from knife crime or in America be shot if you are a certain skin colour. It's not fair. I think about the issue of refugees that has been live this week as we've seen boats coming over, some making it, some not, and the way they've been treated. I guess we'll have slightly different takes on that, but what is fair? What is just in that situation? We live in a world that longs for justice. And yet, interestingly, we live in a world that is skewed by self-interest. And so often, justice, we just settle for just us. I want justice for me and mine, not justice for everyone. I was fascinated this week as someone sent me a link for a petition for fair A-level results in Wales. And I thought, isn't that interesting? We want ours and us to get justice, but we're not bothered about England. But we're all like that, aren't we? We want fairness for us. And so much of justice in our society depends on privilege or upbringing, either as individuals or in terms of what nation we're born into. Sometimes our pursuit of justice for us creates injustice for others. Justice may be something we long for. We may recognise it when it's not there, as we say it's not fair, but we have a really complex relationship with it. What would a just world look like? Just think about that for a minute. Not just for you and yours, but for everyone. What would it look like to have a society where everybody was treated justly from the moment of birth throughout their life? What would it look like if we didn't have just a judicial system that deals, however imperfectly, with the letter of the law, and that's what we restrict justice to, but instead justice was something societies in the world was founded and lived and breathed? It's quite a hard concept to get our heads around, isn't it? And the problem is that so often our view of justice is skewed. Now that was the case for the Jews in Jesus' day. They read the promises in the Old Testament about the Messiah and they limited it a little bit. They believed the Messiah would come and he would bring justice, but it would be justice for them. And that would mean kicking out the Romans, restoring the Jewish kingship, and Israel becoming great again. You can see where somebody got their political slogan from. Someone who would show their power in a shock and awe display of triumphant freedom fighting. But it would be just for us. But we've seen as we've gone through Matthew, there's been this growing conflict because Jesus doesn't fit that picture. Never once does Jesus appeal to nationalism. He doesn't condemn the Romans. In fact, Jesus preaching about the kingdom seems to challenge the ideas of the Jews about what God's kingdom would look like. He's challenged the religious. Instead, he's welcomed the nomarchs, the centurion, the outsiders, those without power or influence, those who could do nothing to advance a political kingdom now. And actually, Jesus' kingdom has come and it seems to have relatively little power. If you remember a few weeks ago, we looked at the start of chapter 11. And there you get John the Baptist, who is the prophetic forerunner of Jesus. And he's a bit confused about Jesus. He sends his disciples to ask, are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else? And the issue for John is, where's the power? Where's the judgment? Where's the pyrotechnic, spirit-fueled display of the glory of God that would cleanse Israel that we were expecting? You see, the issue in these chapters in Matthew is, who is Jesus and what's his kingdom like? What does it do? Last week we saw this clash, didn't we, over the Sabbath. Jesus teaches with authority. He shows his compassion. He heals someone. And yet what do the Pharisees do? They plot how they will kill him. What has Jesus done to deserve that? Absolutely nothing. He does good and he gets plotted against for it. Now here's the question. How do you think Jesus should respond to that? What should Jesus do as he's done good and the Pharisees plot against him? Now we might think, Jesus should plot. Jesus should get them back. Jesus should fight. Jesus should confront their hypocrisy. He should put a dossier together and send it to the Roman rulers. Maybe he should just speak and call down justice on them, or just do something. But look what Jesus does in verse 15. Aware of this, that's the plot, Jesus withdrew from that place. It's an odd reaction, isn't it? What is Jesus doing? Why does he go into retreat? Is he running away from conflict? And then look at the next verse. We read, a large crowd followed him and he healed all who were ill. He warned them not to tell others about him. You think, what Jesus, what are you doing? If you've come to bring the kingdom and you want people to know about it, why are you healing people miraculously and then telling them not to say anything? Why keep quiet? Is Jesus afraid? Is he trying to stay under the radar? What kind of kingdom grows in secret? What kind of Messiah gets people to be quiet? Well, Matthew doesn't want his readers to be confused. And so Matthew wants them to understand who Jesus really is. He wants them to be in no doubt about the nature of the kingdom he brings. But he also wants them to see the contrast between the kingdoms of the world and his kingdom, between his leadership and their leadership. So that we understand and they understand who Jesus is. Now the way he does that, now look at verse 17, is he takes them back to the Old Testament. If we want to understand Jesus and what he does, we will find the answer in the promises God gives in the Old Testament. He takes us to Isaiah 42 verses 1 to 3. And that's the lens, he says, we're to view God's kingdom through. And we see three things. Here's the first. Jesus is God's beloved, spirit-filled servant. Look at verse 18. For Matthew's readers, the temptation was to doubt who Jesus was. The pressure was on. To follow Jesus was to abandon other beliefs. It was alienating, it was separating, it could cost you your family, it could certainly cost you your livelihood, it would cost you any respect in the society they lived in. It was really hard to follow Jesus. That's why Matthew writes his gospel, so that they see who Jesus is and they see that he's worth standing for. So that they share the good news that Jesus is all God's promises fulfilled. And as Matthew quotes these verses, what he's actually saying, Jesus is the servant of all of the servant psalms, all of Isaiah 42 to 53. He's everything that God promised. And look what we read there in verse 18. He says, look, here is my servant. Jesus is God's servant, Matthew said, chosen by him and loved by God. He is loved by the Father. He reiterates that with the phrase, in whom I delight. God delights in Jesus. He may not be doing things the way the world is doing it. He may not be doing it the way the Pharisees would do it. But God loves what Jesus is doing. Matthew's already made that clear for us. Back in Matthew 3, as Jesus is baptized, as he comes up out of the water, God speaks and he says this, this is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. The Father says, I love Jesus. I love what he's doing. He's doing exactly what we planned for eternity. And Matthew will recall that same affirmation again at the Transfiguration in chapter 17. God says, this is my son whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him. See, Matthew wants us to understand Jesus may be different from the world's expectations. He may be different from the Pharisees' expectations. But he is God's sent servant, beloved of the Father, who obeys the Father perfectly, and God delights in him. Jesus is God's servant on God's mission. The Pharisees may reject him, but in doing so, they reject God's word, God's plan, and God's servant. Look at the next thing that the verses in Isaiah tell us. I will put my spirit on him, Isaiah writes. Now again, it is baptism. The Spirit, visibly as a dove, descends on Jesus. Not to fill in for the first time. You read the narratives of Jesus' birth, and he's described as being Spirit-filled already, but as an outward picture of an already reality. Now, the Spirit of God for the Old Testament people of God was a spirit of power. The Spirit of God came on people like the judges. And when the Spirit of power came on them, they acted in ways that saved God's people. Think of Samson. At the last moment of his life, trapped by the Philistines, he prays for God to fill him with his Spirit. He does, and what does he do? He destroys the temple. Think of characters like Deborah and others filled by the Spirit of God to do specific, amazing things. The Spirit also empowered kings and prophets and priests. God, the Spirit at work, moving people to work for his kingdom, empowering and anointing. And Matthew says, as he quotes Isaiah, Jesus knows that too. And do you see why that's significant? Jesus doesn't withdraw here because of weakness or fear of failure. He could have overpowered and out-argued any opponent. He knows of the Pharisees' plot. He could have exposed them. Remember what we've seen already? He's raised the dead, he's stilled the storm, he's cast out demons. He could easily have dealt with the Pharisees. But he delights his Father and obeys his will. He will follow the plan they have had from eternity. He will be the servant who both speaks the word of God, who brings justice, but will also be the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 who goes to the cross. But his time is not yet, and so he withdraws and tells the people not to talk about him. Look at verse 19. It tells us more about Jesus. Jesus doesn't come seeking attention. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. Jesus doesn't court celebrity, fame, or infamy. If Jesus were alive today, he wouldn't shout over his opponents. He wouldn't have a shouty Twitter feed or call press conferences to denigrate people who challenged him. I mean, we recognise that's not great leadership, don't we? But it's certainly not the method of God's kingdom. That Jesus doesn't quarrel or cry out, it says. He isn't shouting on the streets. What's Matthew telling us? Jesus builds the kingdom quietly, gently, and humbly. He isn't insisting on being at the centres of power. That's why he's not in Rome. That's why he's not in Jerusalem. He quietly does God's will, quietly proclaims the kingdom, and through his words, God's kingdom is built. As Jesus speaks and he acts in the ordinary and everyday places among ordinary and everyday people. Jesus is God's King, the servant of the Lord, the Messiah. The call for those reading, for Matthew's readers, is believe in him. Don't let the Pharisees' doubts and questions and Jesus' withdrawal here convince you that he doesn't have the answers, that he's not the Messiah. Trust in him. He is God's King, bringing God's kingdom. But the kingdom looks different. He's the gentle, humble king. His kingdom's not one of glitz and glamour and fame. It exists in contrast to the world and its rulers and doesn't copy them. That's the pattern of the kingdom. That will be the pattern of the church. And Matthew wants his readers to understand that. The Spirit preserves these words so that we understand that. Jesus is not a CEO. He's not a celebrity. He's not a power-hungry world leader. He is the Spirit-filled, loved servant of God come to bring his kingdom. And that's good news because we don't need a kingdom like every other kingdom we see around us. We don't need more leaders like those we see on the media. We need something different. And that is Jesus, who's not concerned for himself, but is concerned for people, who looks and sees people, as we've seen elsewhere, as sheep without a shepherd, harassed and helpless. That's Jesus' kingdom. And it should be seen in the church. And here's the second thing we see. It's the kingdom we all long for. The question is, what's this kingdom like? Well, there are two repeated words in this quote from Isaiah that reveal God's purpose. I wonder if you spotted them. Look at verse 18. The last phrase says that he will proclaim justice to the nations. And then look down at verse 20, it says, till he has brought justice through to victory. In his name the nations will put their hope. Do you spot the two words? It's nations and justice. Jesus comes to bring justice to the nations. That's the whole world. Now that's a pretty big aim, isn't it? Not just one nation, but to all nations. God's purpose is much bigger than we often shrink it down to. I wonder what you think of when you think of the word justice. You might think of sirens, arrest, court, judge, jury, sentence. That's how we tend to think of justice. It is someone breaks the law, they get punished. Someone gets arrested, but they haven't broken the law, they get acquitted. But the Bible's view of justice actually is much, much bigger than that legal, narrow definition. That's just one tiny part of justice. God's blueprint for the world as that it is a place of justice, full stop. Not just with a legal system, but where everything is done justly. It's supposed to mark out God's kingdom. In fact, you read the Old Testament prophets, that's one of the things that makes God so sad when he looks at Israel. A place that he designed to be a place of justice fails to be that. They fail to be compassionate with the foreigner and the widow and the orphan. They fail to be just in the way they do their business. They fail to be just in the way they care for any and everyone, including their family, their parents, their children. They fail to be just in the way they care for other nation states. Justice in the Bible is where God's will is done. Jesus' prayer that he teaches his disciples, where they pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, is a prayer for this big God-sized picture of justice. And Matthew quotes Isaiah to tell us Jesus comes to bring justice to the nations. It's shorthand for a world and society as God always intended it to be. The world we were made for. The kingdom Jesus comes to bring in, where the impact and effects of sin are rolled away and justice is the norm. Now, isn't that the world we long for? A world of justice, not just in legal narrow terms, but where everyone has enough. Everyone has access to water, everyone has access to food. Everyone is valued and treated equally without prejudice. That's the ache that is behind every protest movement, isn't it? Behind every "it's not fair" is this desire for a just world. That is God's kingdom, a better world, a world of compassion and love and righteousness without poverty, bigotry or suffering. A world of justice, life lived enjoying the rule of a loving and just God. But our world is far from that, isn't it? We spoke about some things earlier where we've seen injustice with the "it's not fair," but also, have you noticed how quickly our world uses justice and weaponizes it? Competing claims made by different sides. Selfishness, hatred, prejudice, corruption, limit and warp even attempts to bring justice. So often what people aim for with justice, they end up settling for something pragmatic that's only halfway there. We long for justice, but doesn't part of you feel as you read this, Jesus, this is too big a task. You can't bring justice to the world. We long for it, we hope for it, but we know we can't bring it about. We look at history and we see we can't, but we also begin to wonder, well, Jesus, are you going to do this? We were made for it, we long for it, but how does this happen if sin twists even our good desires? Well, look at verse 20. Jesus proclaims justice as he preaches the kingdom, but look at the promise. It says, he has brought justice through to victory. Jesus will, till he has, one day he will bring justice. One day Jesus will do what he promises. In Jesus' kingdom, when it fully comes, justice will be a reality. Do you know what? That's why it's a tragedy when there is not justice in the church. That's why it's a tragedy in some of the church too things that we have seen. That's why it's a tragedy when we don't love and care for each other so well. But Jesus promises one day he will do what he can't do. The church, like anything, is not perfect now. It ought to be changing. It ought to be holding out these ideals. But here's the question, how does Jesus bring about that kingdom then? If we can't make it ourselves, how is he going to sufficiently change us so that there will be a kingdom of justice? Well, here's the last thing this morning, is this: the king we can come to. We're used to entry requirements, aren't we? The restaurant or club that you can't enter in shorts and jeans. Yeah? Ever been caught out by that? You go to turn up to eat and you can't come in, I'm sorry, you've got trainers on. Or the grades you need to get on a course. Or the haircut you have to go to school. My boys were already saying, you can't have my haircut again, it'll be too different to be allowed in school. We're used to that, entry requirements. But what about in God's kingdom? If Jesus is bringing his kingdom of justice and we long for it, how do we get in on it? Maybe you think, well, surely you have to be good. Perhaps Jesus just takes the cream, the top 5%, in terms of morality, the best people, the nicest people. Or only those with so many hours of community service or church attendance, or those who can afford to give big sums to charity. Look at verse 20. This is a fascinating verse. Listen to this. A bruised reed he will not break, and a smouldering wick he will not snuff out till he has brought justice through to victory. Reeds were plentiful. You would walk different places across Israel and you would see banks of reeds by riversides. They were cheap and you would cut them and you would use them as a flute or a measure or a pen. But you know what? You only took the best ones. If a reed was bent or it was bruised, it was useless and you discarded it and it was burnt. And think about a smouldering wick. Imagine a candle that you can never get to light. All the wick does is smoulder and just give off smoke. That would be more irritating even than those birthday candles that relight, wouldn't it? All it does is just fill that house with smoke and it never does what it's supposed to do. What would you do with such a candle? You throw it out. Well, they're the images Jesus gives, or Isaiah gives, about Jesus. And what does he say? Jesus won't break bruised reeds. Jesus doesn't snuff out smouldering wicks. Jesus comes and he builds his kingdom not on the top 5%, not on the most moral, not on the best, not on those who do good, but he builds his kingdom of bruised reeds and smouldering wicks. Jesus redeems and repurposes and refits those who are not fit for his kingdom, so they are. Jesus' kingdom isn't full of successes, they're religiously self-made. It's full of the bruised and the smouldering, those society discards. We've seen that in Matthew's gospel, haven't we? Who's been entering the kingdom? The lepers, the tax collectors, the lame, the blind. Those their society rejected as weak and failures. But Jesus accepts them. Jesus is the doctor for those who recognise they're sick. He's the king who welcomes sinners. You and I are bruised reeds. We are smouldering wicks. All of us. None of us do justice perfectly. We default to just us, just me and mine. I want it to be fair for those around me. And that means that none of us can meet God's standards. If we were let into the kingdom Jesus promises to bring, well, that kingdom would fail. All of us are unjust, be it in the words we sling that wound someone, in our selfish hoarding that reveals a lack of love for others, in our prejudice, in our desires for self-gain. We can't create the world we long for, and so often in attempting to do so, we just cause more injustice. But how does Jesus treat us? Jesus will treat us the same way he treated the Pharisees who plotted against him. Notice what Jesus does. He doesn't go on the offensive. He doesn't bin them off. He doesn't burn and scorch his way through them as they oppose him and plot and scheme. He withdraws. He comes back and he teaches them again and again and again, calling them to know him, to trust in him. He is gentle and humble. He takes these bruised reeds and he keeps on teaching. He doesn't reject them until even as he goes to the cross. And some of the Pharisees are at the foot of the cross cursing him. What does he say? Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Jesus doesn't burn and scorch his way through and reject those who reject him. He patiently waits, calling us again and again to come and trust him. Our sin, as we thought about the children, deserves God's anger. It deserves punishment. Our injustice does. But Jesus bears that punishment for us on the cross. And he gently and humbly offers salvation to anyone that needs it. Not who is good enough, but who just longs for a world. The world that Jesus promises that we see here. And he gently and humbly offers salvation to those who need it. Now let me be really clear. It's not that he will never judge. Isaiah gives us a picture of a day when one day Jesus does come, and he comes and judges. But you know, he is so loving and gentle. He waits now, giving us opportunity to trust him, to confess our sin, to express our longing for the kingdom of justice and find forgiveness. The challenge for us is, will we? But that also is the pattern of his kingdom, not just on entry, but again and again and again. Jesus' kingdom is a kingdom full of bruised reeds and smouldering wicks. Maybe this morning you're feeling your bruises. Bruises inflicted by others. Bruises inflicted by yourself. Maybe even bruises inflicted by God to bring you back from wandering away from him. Do you see the good news that there is in verse 20? Jesus will not break you if you come to him. He won't meet you with judgment. He will meet you with a gentle welcome. He doesn't stand there with his arms folded, tutting. He opens his arms to you in love. And maybe this morning you feel useless, like that bruised reed, like that smouldering wick. Perhaps you feel your failure in following Jesus, how easily you've drifted over recent weeks, how quick you are to sin, maybe the same sin that you always struggle with, how frequently your heart is drawn to love other things, how quickly we doubt God's goodness. And you feel that, you know what, as a Christian, you're pretty useless. Jesus' kingdom is a kingdom of bruised reeds and smouldering wicks. He will redeem, refit, and repurpose. He won't cast you out. He doesn't bench his followers. Jesus is the King of the kingdom we all want. And he offers us his welcome if we'll confess our sin and trust him. He knows our longing for justice. And he wants us to have that hope that one day his kingdom will come and justice will be done. And we will know him and we will know the Father. But for now, he is a king who is drawn to our weakness and our failure and covers it with his strength and victory. Whose arms are open wide, who will bring his kingdom, the kingdom we long for, if we trust him. And that is good news. That is news worth sharing. That God's kingdom is different because God's king is different. He welcomes all. And the nations can put their hope in him.